there guys, it's me Malorian, and it's time to answer another question that I got from one of you, my viewers. Now this question is going to be coming from another local. It is from James Martin Cooper Hackett, and what James asks is, newer players would benefit from a video on learning to play on a clock. Clock etiquette would also be beneficial. How many seconds into my opponent's tough roll, dodge, movement, etc. should I wait before passing the clock on them? If my opponent requests a rule check or a judge ruling, whose clock does that happen on? And when is it appropriate or inappropriate to pause the clock? Now, I think I've gotten this question, I don't know how many times, I've answered it how many times, but it keeps on coming up. And I think the big reason is that this is actually one of my real strengths. This is something where I brag about it because, I mean, like, I have not clocked in Mark III before at all, and I can't even remember the last time I clocked. Like, obviously I have, like, back when I was new, but it has been years since I last clocked, and there's definitely some skills and tactics that I use to make sure that doesn't happen. And I want to make sure I pass this over to other players because it's really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, you'll just win more, right? If you are not losing games because this clock is mad at you for being a little bit too slow, you're right there going to be winning more games. So that's great. The other thing is just the frustration, especially for newer players. You know, they feel robbed, or even experienced players can feel robbed because, like, say, for a new one, oh, I just want to play this game, but my clock keeps running out, and so now I just got to pack up my models without actually bringing this game to resolution. Or experienced players being like, oh, if I just had more time, I could have done this or this or this, and that frustration can really eat at them and make them enjoy the game less. So it really is in your extreme benefit to be better at clock. So that's why I get this question, and that's why it's important for you to learn it. So I think the way I'm going to answer this is I'm going to start from the start and kind of like work through a turn, or a game rather, to kind of really explain all the different things you should be doing to really enable the fact that you should be able to not clock ever. And that's my goal. You know, if I can try and teach you these things, you can practice them, maybe no one's going to ever clock ever. And you know, I don't think that's actually completely an unrealistic idea. Alright, so here's the first thing that you want to do. Before the game even starts, you need to know your rules. Now this sounds like a nerdy thing you gotta do, is go there and do your homework, but it's literally true. You need to go through and understand your models, your rules, the rules of the game, so that when it comes to the actual game that you're playing on the clock, you're not wasting your time having a look at, like, how does a throw work again? How does this interact? And I mean, like, nobody's going to ever know really everything. I still have to look up some things to be sure, but at the very least you should be knowing at a baseline your own things, and then the more you know, the better. So for example, you should never have to stop and lose time because you're like, oh, what was the rat of my model again? Or how did that rule of my model work again? I mean, if you're going to a tournament, one of the first things I'll do is I'll run through my cards on War Room and just make sure, yep, and just have it all fresh in my mind. And then that way you're just not wasting those critical seconds. And I think there's a big thing as I'm talking through all these, is there's not really ever one step that really kills a person. It's really usually a culmination of these things that really come together. You lose a minute here, you lose a minute there, and all of a sudden you add these things together. Well, you're not playing with a 60-minute clock, you're playing with a 45-minute clock, and that's why people then lose in the end. So that's really important. Know the game as much as you can. Know your own rules as much as you can. So that's not going to catch you. The next thing is that your list that you're using should have a plan before the game even begins. When you create this list, there should be a strategy already in place that this is how it's going to work, this is how it's going to deploy, and this is how I'm going to actually use it against my opponent. Now, of course, those things will slightly change game to game. Maybe terrain will change that, where, oh, there's lots of force over here, I'll have to go differently with that. Or maybe the scenario's different, I'll have to do that. Or maybe I really want this different matchup to happen, so I have to go differently for that. But in general, the way where these models have to synergize together, this is how my deployment should normally be, should be already set in your head. First turn I got to do these upkeeps, so I got to be this far from each other. And I've seen some people actually practice this at home. They'll deploy it at home or maybe just through practice games or something. But I mean, this deployment is on your clock. And I mean, the big thing to keep in mind is that I run a lot of models and I rarely take more than 2 minutes for all deployment. So it really shouldn't take you all that long, especially if you have a smaller army. And something else you might as well just put into this as well is that if you're a person who's really struggling with clock, you might want to think about either having a smaller army with a smaller model count, just to make it easier for yourself because you have fewer things to move, fewer things to think about, or you might also just want to be taking an army that is just simpler in general. I mean, one of the lists that made me the closest to clocking was Haley 3 because she has so many options, so many different things to consider and do, and just the way that you gotta roll these things out in order of activations. And so maybe if you're struggling with clock, make your list simpler. I mean, a list like my 3 big boys is like 3 big colossals, wonderful on clock. This big thing goes here and does this, and this big thing goes there and goes that, done. You know, like, you can always just make your list easier for yourself. So think about that if you're really struggling, but I think in general, just already have a plan before the game. Now the next thing is before you actually start the game, have your things all ready. Now I'm not saying anything, you know, kind of like dodgy, like have all your models kind of like pre-deployed and you just have to move them back 6 inches. I'm not going to say stuff like that, but just have everything ready. Before the clock is on you, you should have everything pulled out of your bag, all your tools taken out, so your measurement sticks if you have them, your tokens, hopefully your tokens are organized. I just picked up a thing from the dollar store that has different sections, you know. If you bring your tokens in a Ziploc baggie, you're going to lose time trying to organize these, right? So having them pre-organized is really going to save you some time there. All right, now you want to have your models around, and so whether you're one of these people that has them on the side or has them in front of you, whatever, you just want to have everything ready to go. And I think the first thing here with that clock etiquette is have that known with your opponent, right? I've had it sometimes where people pull out their things, you're like, okay, you're going first, clock to you. And it's like, look, buddy, you know, we don't need to start this game until we're both good and ready. So let's both get good and ready. You know, also just seeing where people like mark out how far out they can deploy and stuff like that, right? Whatever you need to do before the game, do that before the game. All right, so that's all the before the game things done. Let's talk about during the game. And the first thing is going to be, well, your first turn. And your first turn should be extremely short. If I look at my opponent and their first turn took somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes, that's telling me I'm probably going to win this game on clock, especially if they're getting closer to 10 minutes for the first turn. That's ridiculous. And so the main thing is on your first turn, there's probably like no interactions. If you're going actually first, you're pretty much just running everything up. Oh, there goes the furnace. And then if you're going like second on the first turn, you're either just running things up or just staying out of range and running up to that point. So upkeep, off we go. All right? And so that really shouldn't take that long. And so if you are one of these people where your first turn is taking 10 minutes because you're thinking like, how am I going to deal with this, and how do I want to deploy my models and stuff like that, there's probably 2 things happening there. One, you didn't do your planning before like you should have, and second, you're maybe a person that suffers from like decision paralysis, right? Analysis paralysis. And you have to always think about that this game can be a lot more simpler than you need to make it sometimes. You know, sometimes it's worth it to invest the time for how carefully do I want to position everything, and then there's other times where it just really doesn't matter and it's not worth that time to think about. But I'm going to get into that one a little bit more. So as we get into further and further turns, I want to stress the fact that you should be planning during your opponent's turn. So whenever your opponent moves and does an activation, you're already thinking about what you're going to be doing on your turn about it. Okay, that moved into my range, I can be attacking that. That's scoring here, I have to kill that. Okay. And so usually, by the time it gets to your turn, you should just know everything that you need to do. Now, of course, sometimes there's like a late second last activation type of thing that really changes everything. So maybe something came up and it feeded, and maybe you just like, again, you didn't understand they had a feed, or maybe they got really lucky and they're like, but oh, what do you know, I got this lucky super roll and I knocked out this critical model that you thought you were going to have, right? So sometimes you have to deal with those things, but in the vast majority of times, you should know by your turn, and you should be able to hit the ground running so that when they clock over to you, bam, you're out the door and you're executing your turn. So really try and plan those things out. And I think the next thing you can really be adding to your clock is just how salty you get. You know, like sometimes you'll have people where they get a bad roll, or they make a small mistake, or something happens and they just spend all this time complaining about it. They're like, oh, this always happens to me. Oh, screwed over by dice again. I can't believe this. I can't believe this. And they're just sitting there doing nothing for the game and just repeating this negativity in their mind. And we can talk about, like, you know, like mental health and what that actually does for you to have a strong game past this. But since we're focusing on clock, it's just killing your clock. And I'll tell you that one of the things I used to honestly do is that if I was playing against somebody that I knew got salty, I would immediately, first thing, try and do is get them salty. And if they're talking about like, oh yeah, this is really tough, it's like, yep, that's really tough. That really is a bad part of the game. And it's something I've stopped doing because I'm just not a good person for doing it, right? I should be, as a press ganger, trying to encourage this game, encourage people having enjoyment in this game. So it's not something I do, but it just really shows you how powerful it is. And if you lose 10 minutes of your clock complaining about the game, well, your odds of winning are skyrocketing down. Skyrocketing, it says usually up, but plummeting down, and it's just nothing you can have there. So you can have a bad game, you can be upset by a game, but just don't waste your time about that during it, you know? As soon as it's done, you know, go off and talk about it then, like, oh man, if, you know, on turn 2, if I would have got that critical dice roll, ho ho ho, or, oh man, I made this one mistake, and if I just wouldn't have done that, like, that's the time to talk about it. Do your reflection after the game. Don't be doing it during the game. Alright, I think the next thing I want to be talking about then is just a lot of those kind of like etiquette things that James asked for. So things like, should you be clocking over during movement or toughness tests and stuff like that. And I think that what this really comes down to is, first of all, how bad is your opponent at clock? You know, I've had people clock it over to me for my toughs, but I'm really fast, right? When I have to take a tough, I go. But I mean, and I'm fine with that. I don't care. But I've seen other times where, oh, it's my tough turn. Okay, I'm gonna get a dice. Yeah, it's gotta be 5+. I'll roll it here. Yeah, it's dead. Okay, you know, like. You can really draw these things out. And so if you have someone that is doing that to you, and maybe they're actually trying to do that to drain your clock, more likely they're doing it just because, you know, they're new at the game or whatever, they're just super relaxed, who knows what it is. It is up to you to say when you clock. It is in your right, so that whenever your opponent is doing something, whether they're making a movement because they have counter charge, whether they're making a roll, if they're looking up a rule, you can clock to them. And maybe one of the things that you can maybe get used to is that if you're a person that's going to be doing that, let your opponent know before the game. One of the things that people have been doing here lately is saying, like, look, what we're going to do before the game is we're going to agree that whoever's turn it is the person that's going to be marking and updating what the turn is and what the control points are before you pass over. Or saying that, look, I play a clean game. If you are ever going to be having a rule that you are dealing with on your time, I will be clocking to you. And that way there's no surprises. One of the things that can get people the most annoyed is, let's say if normally they're letting you do your tough rolls on their clock, and all of a sudden now they're clocking over to you, well, you can feel like, geez, I'm not going slow, but maybe they're just worried about their own clock. Like, geez, I'm down to 2 minutes. I can't lose any time for you. Now, etiquette can be a big part there, but I think the largest thing to keep in mind is that if you really think about everything else I've been talking about, remember that everything is a culmination, so the better you get at doing everything else, the less this part will really matter. You know, keep in mind that when I play my games and I don't clock, I never clock over for tough rolls. Sometimes when people are doing like longer counter charges, sure, I'll clock over for something like that. But like when people ask me like, oh, are we going to clock over or do whatever when you're marking things down, I'm like, whatever, do it on my turn. I don't care. Because if you save by doing these other strategies 10 minutes off your clock, and then all of a sudden the let's go to extreme 2 minutes that we're adding to tough rolls really doesn't matter in the end. So I don't do it, but again, it's just something where it's best to let your opponent know beforehand, and then be consistent, and the better that you do with everything else, the less important this is. Alright, the last thing I want to touch on is pausing the clock. Now, I think the first thing, I'm struggling here, guys. I need to blow my nose. This is a time management thing. I'm trying to pause this, so hopefully I'm not going to be snorting here too much. But here's the big thing, guys. Pausing the clock. You're not supposed to do it. When it comes to like a friendly game at somebody's like house or the store during like the weekly game, go ahead, pause whenever you need. Who really cares? But when you are playing against somebody else at a tournament rules specify you're not supposed to pause the clock. And this is because tournaments are run on a timeline. This game has to end here so we can do lunch. We have to start the next game here so we can be done here because the store closes at this time. And so they might even be around and be like, hey, look, for your getting ready, you don't have infinity time. We're going to give you X minutes, and then your clocks. If you haven't started them, I'm going to start them. So you're not supposed to be pausing the clock. So again, this is not something that's, you know, there's no police coming. They're not going to lock you up because you paused the clock. So I even have some locals refer that same thing for like the control points and stuff like that. They'll say like, hey, at the end of every turn, we're going to pause the clock and we're going to go in there and we're going to mark it down. And to be honest, most of the time that doesn't matter and the TO won't care. If you're one of these people that takes forever and all of a sudden you're always the last game and it's going long, they might watch and they might punish you or reprimand you for pausing your clock. But in general, if you're someone that actually is fast, you could get away with it. But I think your best practice is just not, because especially if you're in a big event, that could be a disqualification. You know, I've even heard some dodgy things where they try and get their opponent to pause the clock, and then they're like, oh, judge, he paused the clock, disqualified. And that's just, don't get into that, the dodgy things. It's just bad for the game and how we actually do this and then try and enjoy this. So when it comes to around like judge calls and stuff like that, when I say judge, I can't pause the clock. Immediately, I'm going to say, judge, I have a call. Can I pause the clock? And they'll be like, yep. And so you can pause the clock then. So only when the judge tells you you can pause that clock, you do that. Now, James, you went there and you also specified, you know, what if it's a rules clarification? Something that you should realize is that there's a lot of things you can put to the judge. So sometimes there's times when you and your opponent don't agree and you need to have a judge come in. There's other times where you're just not really sure about a rule, or maybe there's a really close precision measurement. So this thing's going to be walking around here. We need to do these steppers and put this down. You can do that on your own clock as it being your turn. You can be taking, you know, how many minutes to do that, but take advantage of the fact that you can put that on the judge. Not only then will you be like, judge, they'll pause the clock and they'll resolve it for you, and that won't be a cost to you from your clock, but secondly, in theory, it'll be done better, right? There won't be rushing. There maybe have more experience and better at doing these things or just know the rules. And so all of a sudden, they're going to take care of that. So especially at like a big event or something like that, if I have a very close thing, we're like, hey, this game really depends on whether I can do this, get to this spot, how this roll works. Let's just make sure with the judge. Judge comes over, pauses the clock, and then explains everything, and we keep on going. And it's just like you went through like magical mystical land where just like time stopped, you learned everything you needed to learn, maybe the board state advanced to exactly where you need it to be, and then time just starts up again, right? So take advantage of that resource and what you have with you. Now, I think the last thing I want to cover is last second rushes. Now, you usually see like last turn, people are like, and going as fast as they can. And I think the first thing to realize there is that if you save time beforehand, you will not be suffering for this rush at the end of the game. So if you spend 5 less minutes on your first turn, you'll have 5 more minutes for your last turn. So keep that in mind. The other thing too is realize that there is a value for everything you do, and to also be aware of your clock. You know, if you're in a stage here where you've already won the game, you just get a clock over, but you really would like to kill that caster too, even though you're going to win on scenario, just clock over. You know, like, don't waste your time. But also realize that just that cost. So always be knowing where you are, and if you have to be doing a fast turn, but also be realizing that there's a cost to everything you do, being that if I want to think about something, that's going to cost me time. If I want to be doing something like moving or doing an attack, that's going to cost me time. And it's not always worth it. Your resource, just like how your models being alive or your control points is a resource that you have, your clock is also a resource. So I can be taking these shots, and I can be rolling them with these little POW 10s. I can be rolling the hit, rolling damage, hoping for spikes, but in the end, I might spend 2 minutes of my clock, and is that 2 minutes worth the damage I might do? In a lot of cases, it's not. It's funny, my opponents are sometimes surprised where I'm just running a unit into there. Now, of course, I play a strategy where I jam a lot, but they're like, well, you're jamming, but you might as well make the attacks. I'm like, no, I am not going to do that, because even though I could be making these attacks, that's going to be costing me time. And then all of a sudden, it's just not a matter of me saying I have to roll to hit and roll damage for whatever attacks I want to make, but I also have to think about it. This has to charge straight to there, and then I have to leave a path so that this can charge straight to there. No, I'm going to run. I can run in S's if I want. I'm going to get in there. I'm going to move over, because in the end, even if everything goes great, what, I kill like 2 more models? Woo, that doesn't really matter, right? What I'm trying to do with my strategy is I'm trying to block you there, and killing 2 little models, even though it's going to be beneficial, is just not worth the time. And what that investment does, and what being careful with that resource does, is first of all, probably means that you're not going to clock at the end. But when you have a critical decision moment, when you have to really like, hey, we're in this assassination now, this has to work, now you have the time you need to invest in that. So for decisions that matter and placements that matter, invest that time. For things that don't matter, realize that it might not be the worth that, and then make that call. And I mean, please, don't sit there for 5 minutes trying to decide whether it's worth your time to do something, because then it's too late. You've already invested the time. So you have to be a little bit more decisive in the game with that, but you just have to be aware of the clock, and aware of that everything that you do is going to have a price. So there you go, there's clock management. I kind of had in my head that I want to keep this to a shorter video to be like good on clock, but there's honestly a lot of tricks to it. And so if nothing else, you can start working on some of these things to improve. So maybe you next time want to be working on knowing your rules. Maybe next time you want to be working on a faster deployment. You know, maybe you want to be trying to learn these things by doing a different thing. Maybe during your next game, you want to try and go with time turns. You're going to say, you know what? For every turn, I'm only going to give myself 5 minutes. And whatever I don't get done in 5 minutes, it doesn't get done. And then when you get to a tournament, if you're used to getting all your turns done in 5 minutes, you're going to have no problem whatsoever. Or who knows what you're going to try and do. You know what? Maybe you're a person that doesn't normally clock. You'll clock like once a year. Maybe be a little bit more mindful of your clock and be like, you know, normally I end with like less than 10 minutes. I want to be trying to be ending this next game with at least 15 minutes. That's going to be my goal. You know, always be looking at that and have a goal for yourself. And then all of a sudden that, you know, maybe you clock once a month, once a year, whatever it is. If that becomes 0, like we said at the start of this, it's just better for you. So pick whatever strategy you want to work on. Maybe you want to tackle them all. But if you do this, you're just going to have more fun and you're going to win more games. So there you go, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you later. Bye.